Hello and welcome back. We are going to be back in Hebrews chapter 12, finishing up this chapter today. And again, my name is Nathan House. I'm with the Houston Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be great. Thank you so much. So real quickly, what are we going to see today? We're going to kind of focus on three things as we go through these last few verses of chapter 12. First of all, we're going to see just kind of something that's not a major thread here, but it's an important thread. He's going to mention something about worship. He's going to talk about in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 28, that there are some types of worship that are acceptable, that we need to be worshiping in an acceptable way. And so it begs a question, if some things are acceptable, what does that imply? Well, it implies clearly that some things are unacceptable worship. So we'll talk about that. We're also going to see that in verses 18 through 21, he's contrasting the old covenant with the new covenant. And so we'll see that. Again, that's a major thread of this book, right? The new covenant is better than the old covenant. The things that are pertaining to Jesus Christ are better. And so that takes us to our third point. If the things pertaining to Jesus Christ are better, more significant, why would we refuse to listen to him who is speaking? This idea of Jesus Christ speaking, or God speaking through Jesus Christ, is a major thread in this book. And so we'll quickly look at that major thread, reminding ourselves of where we have seen this idea in this book. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to begin with this idea that some worship is acceptable. And what does that mean? So as we're here at the end of the chapter, and we're going to come back and read it in a moment, but I want you to draw your attention to verse 28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom. And again, he's contrasting, we'll talk about it more in a minute, but he's contrasting the old covenant versus the new covenant. The new covenant and this kingdom that is associated with the new covenant. This kingdom cannot be shaken. It's going to be a permanent kingdom. It's not going to be temporary. The covenant that Jesus Christ brought is going to be a better covenant. It's a permanent covenant. And so then he says, because of this, let us offer to God acceptable worship. So again, what does this mean? What does this imply? Well, clearly, if there is worship that is acceptable, there must be worship that is not acceptable. And in fact, if you recall, Jesus Christ, talking to the woman at the well, right? And he's talking with her, the Samaritan woman, and he tells her, John chapter 4, verse 23, notice what he says, but the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So there is obviously acceptable worship. What is acceptable worship? Worship that is truthful, worship that is spiritual. And he says, for the Father is seeking these kind of people to worship him. And so, we need to be people that are concerned about what is worship, what is God's desire for worship. Way too often today, we want to bring to worship our own design. What does worship look like? What would I want if I were being worshiped? What do I want to do when I worship God? But really, that should not be our approach to worship. Our worship should be, what has God directed us to do in worship? How has God, what has God authorized in worship? It just reminds me of another text so that was John 4:23. So again, notice here, this is Colossians 2:23. Paul says, these have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting, and he uses this phrase, the ESV translates it as self-made religion. And so here we have this word for self-made religion, and it's made up of, two words, and it's dangerous to try to define a word based off the separate root words, right? That's, like saying butterfly doesn't mean a piece of butter that's flying around. But occasionally the word is kind of seen in its compound words. And so here we kind of see the meaning here. The first part of this word, thelo, means somebody's wish or somebody's desire. The second part has to do with worship or religion. So he's talking about here, these things promote self-made religion. Well, self-made religion is not authorized by God. So this word that I've put on the screen for you, here's the definition from BDAG, so this Greek lexicon. Self-made religion, do-it-yourself religion, idiosyncratic religion. That means picking and choosing what you like. I like this part of worship. I'm going to put it over here. And so this type of religion, this type of worship is not pleasing to God. The King James Version actually translates Colossians, and I rarely will use the King James, but I think it's an interesting translation here. It says in Colossians 2:23, which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will worship. So what kind of worship are we talking about? The worship of my will. The worship, again, the ESV uses that phrase, self-made religion. The problem with self-made religion or will worship is that it's not worship that is acceptable to God. Our worship that we bring to God, to our God, needs to be worship that He has authorized. And we're not trying to study that right now, but there are things that God has authorized and there are things that God has not authorized. And so we need to be seeking to worship God according to His will, not our own. Okay, so let's get back to Hebrews chapter 12. And let's go ahead and notice just real quick, again, what do we see? What are we going to see here? Some worship is acceptable. We're also going to see, beginning in verse 18 through 21, going actually through 24, we're going to see this contrasting idea of the old covenant versus the new covenant. So let's look at how he describes the old covenant here. For you have not come. So what they were now experiencing, these Christians who were reading the book of Hebrews, this is not where they were any longer. You have not come to what may be touched. So he's focusing on clearly a physical kingdom, a physical aspect. You have not come to what may be touched. Well, what is that? A blazing fire, darkness and gloom and tempest, the sound of trumpet. What does this sound like? Sounds like the covenant given at Mount Sinai, right? A voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. Well, what is this talking about? Again, the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. They could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. What is this referring to? The giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. He says, you haven't come to this old covenant, these things associated with it. Instead, verse 22, here's the contrasting side of that. You have come to Mount Zion. Well, this is a reference to, again, the city of Jerusalem, right? To the city of the living God. Lots of Old Testament passages we could look at, but the point here is he's making is this is something spiritual. The heavenly city, God's city. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God. And if you go back and you read in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, what do we see? We see this idea of, Abraham was looking forward to a city whose designer and builder was God. So there was this anticipation of a spiritual city, a better city. You've come to that city, the heavenly Jerusalem. So we're not talking about a physical location, but a heavenly one, a spiritual versus a physical. And to innumerable angels in festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled of heaven in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus. This is what we have come to, the heavenly Jerusalem, to all these beautiful, wonderful things enrolled in heaven, to God Himself, and to Jesus. This is what we have come to Jesus, the mediator. And again, this goes back to earlier in the book of Hebrews, right? Where Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant, looking back at Jeremiah chapter 31. To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, this new covenant which said God would not remember their sins any longer. God was going to forgive them of their sins. It was an eternal covenant. This is what these readers had come to. And so again, the Hebrew writer is going to encourage them, guys, hold on to this covenant. See, he's writing to Jewish Christians. And so they were trying to hold on to both Judaism and Christianity. And the Hebrew writer says, guys, forget about the Judaism. Forget about those things. Hold on to Jesus Christ. And so it's kind of interesting. I've talked about it a little bit recently. How many Christian people today are trying to pull Judaism back into Christianity. But the Hebrew writer is saying, guys, let go of that. We have something better. Why would we go back to that? We have come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. And by the fact that this is called new, it makes the old one, as the Hebrew writer would say, old and obsolete, right? To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. And so this idea of better is a reoccurring word. It's a reoccurring theme running through the book of Hebrews. We have something better. Why would we return to animal sacrifices and all the things associated with the old covenant, circumcision? Why would we return to that? We have something better. And so again, we see a contrast, verses 18 through 21 old, verses 22 through 24 new. So right here we have this contrast. And so here we have then in the very next verse, so don't refuse the one who is speaking to you. He's speaking to you about this new covenant, these new better things associated with Jesus Christ. So why would you refuse to listen to him? And this idea of listening to him, to God through Jesus Christ, is a major thread, a major part of the book of Hebrews. So real quickly, let's read this and then let's quickly look back at those threads. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. Why should I care about refusing him? Because there's a danger. There is a grave danger in refusing the one who speaks. There is a grave danger. And in fact, you can go back and you can look at this real quickly. Go back and look at chapter 2, verse 23. I'm sorry, not chapter 2, verse 23. Chapter 2, verse 2. So he makes a point here. Since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect a greater salvation? So here he's making an argument from the lesser to the greater. If we didn't listen, if there was punishment for not listening to the message delivered by angels to Moses, if there was punishment for that, how much worse is it going to be if we don't listen, not to angels, not to Moses, if we don't listen to Jesus Christ? So again, look at what he says. Therefore, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard. We'll look back at that in a minute. What is it we have heard? Well, it's the voice of God through Jesus Christ. We'll see that in a minute. Pay closer attention to what we have heard. Since the message that we heard, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared, this greater message was declared at first by the Lord. It was attested to us by those who heard. So who were those who heard? The apostles. So whoever wrote the book of Hebrews clearly was not an apostle because they heard the message from the apostles. God bore witness to this message. Okay, what I want you to see here is that there was a warning, lesser to greater. If you don't listen to the message of the lesser and there was punishment, how much worse will it be if you don't listen to the message given by somebody greater? You'll see the same type of an argument, lesser to greater, in chapter 10, verse 28. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies. So if they ignored the law of Moses, they died. Verse 29, how much worse? How much worse is it going to be? And he says, do you think? How much worse the punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who is trampled underfoot, the Son of God? You see, there is this argument from lesser to greater. It goes back to chapter 2. We see it again here in chapter 10. We see it here in chapter chapter 12. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them from earth, so here was a warning from earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. So there was an argument from lesser to greater. And the argument is, there was a danger in not listening to Moses. There's an even greater danger in not listening to Jesus Christ. And so there is throughout this book, this call to listen to Jesus Christ, to God. So going back to chapter 1, when the book opens, long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So he's talking about in the past. But in these last days, so as the Christian reader was reading the book of Hebrews, he was saying, but now in these days we're living in, God, right? God spoke to us by his Son. So God spoke to us by his Son. So again, we have to be willing to listen to God through his Son. This goes back to chapter 2, which we looked at just a moment ago. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard. Heard from who? From the Son, who is speaking on behalf of the Father, lest we drift away from it. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation, which was declared at first by the Lord? Then you could even go to chapter 3, I believe it's verse 7. Verse 7, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, so quoting here, if you hear his voice, we have to listen to the voice of God. He spoke in these last days. God has spoken to us through his Son. And so in chapter 12 here, he is calling the reader to listen to the one who warns from heaven. At that time, his voice, going back to the old covenant time, we've seen here back in verse 18, at that time his voice shook the earth. But now, so again, notice the contrasting in time. But now he has promised once more, I'll shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. And so, verse 28, therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Why should they return? Why should these early Jewish Christians return to a kingdom that could be shaken when God has given them a kingdom that cannot be shaken? Why should we today hold on to anything else but to this kingdom? You know, we live in a world that you turn on the news, it is discouraging, it's sad, it's heartbreaking. You see the stuff in Afghanistan where Christians are being persecuted, in Nigeria, and we see in China all these things, and there's so much, you know, those earthly kingdoms, they're not going to last. I don't care how powerful they are, they will not last. Even the old covenant, as great as it was done away with. But you see, we have a new kingdom, a new covenant that will last forever, a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Let's hold on to it. And let's offer to God worship that is pleasing to Him, because He has done great things for us. Our God has done great things. I want to thank you for your attention. God bless.